It is the ultimate exposure of a multi-billion-dollar empire. In July 2026, the state of Utah officially revoked the operating license of the infamous Provo Canyon Boarding School, the exact facility where Paris Hilton exposed a horrific history of teenage abuse. Decades after she was dragged there in the middle of the night, she returned to stand with families and look the institution in the eye. But this isn't just a celebrity headline. This is a terrifying diagnostic look into the darkest corners of human behavior. How do ordinary citizens transform into sadistic monsters behind closed doors? Why did it take 50 years for the truth to dismantle this system? Today, we use behavioral science to decode the chilling architecture of institutional abuse and the psychological traps that force victims into silence. The sanitized matrix. Meet Sarah. She is a 24-year-old college graduate with a degree in social work. She is empathetic, soft-spoken, and deeply values human welfare. Seeking to make a meaningful impact, she accepts a role as a residential supervisor at an elite, private behavioral facility for troubled youth. The glossy brochure promises a sanctuary of healing, structure, and emotional rehabilitation. On her first day, Sarah feels like a savior, but within 3 months, the invisible architecture of the institution begins to re-engineer her entire moral code. She finds herself locking a weeping 14-year-old girl in a bare, solitary confinement room for hours, completely indifferent to the screams. She rationalizes it as protocol compliance. Sarah hasn't become evil. She has fallen victim to the Lucifer effect, coined by legendary psychologist Dr. Philip Zimbardo following the infamous Stanford prison experiment. The Lucifer effect describes how good people turn evil when embedded in a toxic institutional matrix. Institutions achieve this through systematic de-individuation. When Sarah put on her staff badge, her individual identity dissolved into the collective authority of the system. The teenagers were stripped of their clothes, assigned tracking numbers, and explicitly labeled as manipulative or rebellious. By dehumanizing the patients, the institution's framework allowed Sarah's brain to bypass its standard empathetic circuits. Cruelty didn't feel like abuse anymore. It was reframed as a clinical tool to maintain order. The environment dictates the behavior, turning ordinary citizens into active agents of state-sanctioned terror. The authority compliance matrix. As the weeks roll on, the severity of the institutional control intensifies. Sarah witnesses senior staff members utilizing unnecessary physical restraints, aggressively handling clients, and force-feeding heavy chemical sedatives to enforce compliance. Every logical bone in Sarah's body tells her to blow the whistle, but whenever she hints at dissent, the facility director firmly reminds her, "We are the experts here. If you question our methods, you are compromising the safety of this entire campus." Sarah shuts her mouth and goes back to work. She has succumbed to extreme authority compliance. This behavioral trap is rooted in the classic Milgram obedience experiments, which proved that human beings possess a terrifying willingness to inflict severe pain on others if commanded by a legitimate authority figure. In a closed institutional ecosystem like the Utah boarding school network, authority is absolute. Sarah's brain experienced a complete diffusion of responsibility. She told herself, "I am not the one making these policy choices. I am just following orders from the management." By shifting the moral burden up the corporate ladder, her conscience was completely neutralized. The fear of institutional exile, being fired, blacklisted, or branded as a traitor, was interpreted by her primitive survival brain as a greater threat than the routine abuse of the children in her care. Before we see the exact psychological mechanism, that kept survivors like Paris Hilton silent for decades, and decode how this velvet cage was finally broken. Let's protect your own independent mind. If you want to understand how systems manipulate human behavior and learn how to maintain your internal moral locus of control using raw science, hit that subscribe button. The trauma bond and the parent betrayal. But what about the children inside? Why didn't they simply tell their parents? Why did it take decades for survivors to step forward? When Paris Hilton was held at the facility, her communications with the outside world were heavily monitored and aggressively censored. If she tried to complain during a phone call, the line was instantly disconnected, and she was cast into solitary confinement as a penalty. When parents visited, the facility operators deployed a brilliant psychological shield. They told the parents that the children would spin elaborate lies of abuse simply because they were desperate to escape the hard work of treatment. The teens were trapped in the ultimate psychological vice. Trauma bonding combined with learned helplessness. When a human being is completely isolated from their natural protectors and subjected to chronic, unpredictable terror, their nervous system short-circuits. To survive, the brain adapts through trauma bonding, forming a highly dysfunctional, pathologically dependent attachment to the very captors who hold the keys to their survival. Because every attempt to seek help resulted in severe physical or emotional punishment, the children fell into learned helplessness. Their brains recorded a devastating fact. Nobody is coming to save us. Resistance is pointless. When they were finally released, the psychological scarring was so profound that their egos buried the memories in deep vaults of shame. To speak out meant reliving the agonizing reality that their own parents had inadvertently funded their torture, falling hook, line, and sinker for the sophisticated marketing theater of a predatory industry. The cognitive realignment. How did the spell finally break? It didn't happen through institutional self-correction. It happened when the survivors executed a collective cognitive realignment. Step 1. Shift the shame. The turning point arrived when Paris Hilton stopped treating her teenage years as a shameful secret and began framing it as a systemic institutional crime. She stopped asking the industry for an apology and started demanding its total deconstruction. Step 2. Build the collective anchor. By returning to the school gates in Utah, survivors broke the final illusion of the system: isolation. The facility relied on keeping survivors feeling alone in their trauma. The moment they stood together, sharing identical testimonies, the institutional defense of isolated incidents completely collapsed. Step 3. Leverage external force. The revocation of the school's operating license in July 2026 was the direct result of weaponizing public data and passing explicit, protective laws across 16 states. The survivors realized that you cannot fix a corrupted institutional ecosystem from the inside. You must use the absolute, unyielding hammer of external legal sovereignty to shut it down. The closure of the Provo Canyon Springville campus is a monumental victory, but it stands as a permanent warning. It reminds us that whenever we create a closed system with total authority over the vulnerable, devoid of transparency, human psychology will naturally drift toward cruelty. The monster is not a unique individual. The monster is the system we allow to operate in the dark. Stop believing the polished brochures of organizations that demand absolute control over human autonomy. Step out of the compliance matrix. Listen to the voices of the vulnerable, and realize that true justice isn't about maintaining institutional order. It is about protecting the sovereign safety of our children. Did you know the troubled teen industry still operates with billions of dollars in funding across the country? Are we doing enough to monitor the institutions we trust with our youth? Let's have a serious, data-driven conversation in the comments below. Give this video a like if you stand with the survivors today, and I'll see you in the next one.